October 8, 1918, the Argonne Forest. The fog hung thick over the Argonne Forest that morning, turning the dense woodland into a gray labyrinth of shadows and death. Somewhere in that mist, German machine guns chattered their deadly song, cutting down American soldiers who had come to break the Hindenburg Line. The largest American offensive of World War I was stalling, drowning in mud, blood, and the incomprehensible chaos of industrial warfare. In the midst of this hell, a small patrol of 17 men moved through the forest, their mission simple but deadly: find and silence the German machine gun nests that were shredding their regiment. Leading them was Sergeant Bernard Early, a capable soldier but one who would not live to see the end of the day. Among the patrol was a corporal named Alvin Cullum York, a reluctant soldier, a former conscientious objector, a man who had once refused to fight because his religion forbade killing. Within hours, this soft-spoken mountaineer from Tennessee would achieve what seemed impossible. He would kill at least 25 German soldiers, silence 35 machine guns, and capture 132 prisoners. He would do it with marksmanship learned hunting wild turkeys in the Cumberland Mountains, with courage forged in religious conviction, and with a calm determination that would make him one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. This is his story. Chapter 1: The Boy from the Mountains. Alvin Cullum York entered the world on December 13, 1887, in a two-room log cabin in Fentress County, Tennessee, near what is now the community of Pall Mall. He was the third of 11 children born to William Uriah York and Mary Elizabeth Brooks. The family lived on the edge of poverty, subsistence farmers who supplemented their meager crops by hunting, fishing, and whatever work William could find as a blacksmith. The York homestead sat in the rugged country along the Wolf River, where the Cumberland Mountains rolled endlessly toward the horizon. It was isolated, beautiful, and brutally hard country. Young Alvin attended school for exactly 9 months before his father pulled him out to work the farm. Education was a luxury the York family could not afford when there were fields to plow, crops to harvest, and younger mouths to feed. But if Alvin lacked formal education, he received a different kind of schooling, one that would save his life and the lives of countless others years later. But before that, please subscribe to the channel and like it to spread forgotten stories. Get to the point. His father taught him to shoot, and the boy took to it with a natural talent that bordered on the supernatural. By the time he was a teenager, Alvin could hit a running squirrel at 50 yards, shoot a wild turkey's head clean off at distance, and make impossible shots that left other hunters shaking their heads in disbelief. The mountains taught him patience. Hunting taught him to read terrain, to move silently, to wait for hours without moving until the perfect shot presented itself. He learned to control his breathing, to squeeze a trigger without jerking, to compensate for wind and distance by instinct. These skills, honed through years of putting meat on the family table, would one day translate directly to the battlefield. When William York died in November 1911, 24-year-old Alvin became the primary breadwinner for the family. His 2 older brothers had married and moved away, leaving Alvin as the oldest male still living at home. The responsibility weighed heavily on his young shoulders. He took work wherever he could find it: railroad construction in Harriman, logging in the mountains, anything that would bring money home to his mother and younger siblings. The pressure and stress of those years drove young Alvin to drink. He developed a reputation around Pall Mall as a hellraiser, a man who frequented illegal moonshine saloons, gambled away his wages, and got into brutal fistfights. Despite being devoted to his family's welfare, Alvin was spiraling toward a life of alcoholism and violence that killed many men in those hard mountain communities. Chapter 2: The Road to Damascus. Everything changed on New Year's Day, 1915. Alvin attended a revival meeting at the Church of Christ and Christian Union, a small fundamentalist Protestant congregation in Pall Mall. The visiting preacher delivered a fiery sermon about redemption and salvation that struck Alvin like lightning. Years later, he would describe the experience as feeling as if God himself had reached down and grabbed him by the soul. The transformation was immediate and total. Alvin York gave up drinking, gambling, and fighting. He became deeply religious, attending church regularly and embracing the church's strict moral code, including its pacifist teachings that violence was a sin under all circumstances. The wild young man became a thoughtful, quiet believer who read his Bible daily and tried to live according to its principles. His conversion was more than superficial piety. Alvin genuinely wrestled with moral and theological questions. He believed that God commanded, "Thou shalt not kill," and he took that commandment literally. When other young men talked about the possibility of America entering the European War, Alvin said he could never kill another human being, no matter what government orders said. He courted Gracie Williams, a young woman from Pall Mall, with serious intentions of marriage. He worked hard, saved his money, and tried to be the kind of man his faith demanded. Life was good, peaceful, and righteous. Alvin York had found his path, and it seemed clear and straight before him. Then, on June 5, 1917, everything changed. The United States had entered World War I, and every man between 21 and 31 had to register for the draft. Alvin filled out his draft registration card, and on the line asking if he claimed exemption on religious grounds, he wrote simply, "Yes. Don't want to fight." Chapter 3: A Crisis of Conscience. The draft board denied Alvin's claim for conscientious objector status. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not recognized as a historic peace church like the Quakers or Mennonites. Alvin's pastor, Rosier Pyle, wrote letters supporting his claim, but they were rejected. Alvin appealed twice more. Each time, the answer was the same: his claim was denied. On November 14, 1917, Private Alvin C. York reported for duty at Camp Gordon, Georgia, assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. He carried his Bible and his doubts in equal measure. At Camp Gordon, York's company commander, Captain Edward C. Danforth, and his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton, recognized that the quiet Tennessean was struggling with a genuine moral crisis. These were educated, thoughtful officers who understood that a soldier who doubted the righteousness of his cause would be useless, or worse, dangerous, in combat. Rather than dismiss York's concerns or simply order him to obey, they engaged him in long theological and philosophical discussions. They showed him passages from the Bible that seemed to justify righteous warfare: Joshua's battles, David's slaying Goliath, Jesus driving the money changers from the temple. They argued that sometimes war was necessary to protect the innocent, that standing aside while evil triumphed was itself a sin. Major Buxton gave York a 10-day leave to return home and think deeply about his dilemma. Alvin spent those days in prayer, reading his Bible, talking with his pastor and his mother. He walked alone in the mountains where he had hunted as a boy, seeking clarity. According to York's own account, he eventually reached a conclusion that allowed him to reconcile his faith with military service. He came to believe that God would protect him if his cause was just, that fighting against tyranny and oppression was not the same as murder, and that he could serve his country without betraying his conscience. Years later, he would say, "I wanted to follow both God and my country, and I believed I could do both." When York returned to Camp Gordon, he was a changed man, still deeply religious, still thoughtful and serious, but now committed to being the best soldier he could be. Chapter 4: The Making of a Warrior. Private York threw himself into training with the same intensity he had once devoted to hunting. His superiors quickly recognized that the quiet mountaineer possessed extraordinary natural talents. On the rifle range, York's performance was nothing short of phenomenal. He could hit targets that other soldiers could barely see. His shooting was smooth, controlled, almost casual in its efficiency. Corporal Murray Savage, one of York's closest friends in the unit, later recalled, "York could shoot like nobody I ever saw. It wasn't just that he hit the target. Lots of fellas could do that. It was that he never seemed to miss, no matter the conditions, no matter the pressure." York was promoted to corporal just before his unit deployed to France. He arrived at Le Havre on May 1, 1918, part of the massive American buildup that would eventually field over 2 million soldiers on the Western Front. The 82nd Division, nicknamed the All-American because it drew recruits from every state in the Union, immediately began intensive training under British and French instructors. The American soldiers were shocked by what they saw in France. The Western Front in 1918 was an industrialized nightmare beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Miles of trenches, endless barbed wire, artillery bombardments that could last for days, poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks. This was modern warfare, and it bore no resemblance to any conflict in American history. The 328th Infantry's first taste of combat came in the St. Mihiel offensive in September 1918. York and his regiment attacked German positions along the Meuse River, fighting their way through trenches and fortifications. The experience was terrifying and brutal, but York performed well. He followed orders, kept his head during bombardments, and used his marksmanship skills to suppress German positions. But St. Mihiel was just a prelude. The real test was coming. Chapter 5: Into the Argonne. On September 26, 1918, the largest American offensive of World War I began, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Over 1.2 million American and French soldiers attacked along a front stretching from the Meuse River to the Argonne Forest. Their objective was to break through the Hindenburg Line, cut the German army's main supply route through Sedan, and force Germany to surrender. The Argonne Forest was a nightmare of terrain. Dense woods, steep ravines, thick underbrush, and swamps made movement nearly impossible. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the area with concrete bunkers, elaborate trench systems, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Every hill, every clearing, every approach was pre-registered for artillery. The forest was a killing ground, and the Germans knew every inch of it. The initial American assault made some progress, but within days the offensive ground to a halt. Inexperienced American divisions, many seeing combat for the first time, suffered appalling casualties. Units became confused in the dense forest. Communication broke down. Supply lines stretched to breaking. The wounded languished for days before they could be evacuated. The influenza epidemic that was sweeping the world hit the crowded trenches particularly hard. By early October, the 328th Infantry had been fighting for over a week. They were exhausted, depleted, and still facing fierce German resistance. The regiment was tasked with capturing Hill 223, which overlooked the Decauville Railroad, a narrow-gauge railway the Germans used to supply their forces. Taking that railroad was essential to breaking the German defense. On October 7, York's company pushed forward through heavy resistance. They spent the night in a muddy position, enduring sporadic artillery fire and sniper shots. Everyone knew that tomorrow would bring another attack, and probably more casualties. That night, Corporal Alvin York cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and read a few verses from his pocket Bible. He thought about his mother and Gracie back home in Tennessee. He prayed for guidance and protection. And he steeled himself for whatever the morning would bring. Chapter 6: The Mission. At dawn on October 8, 1918, Sergeant Bernard Early received orders to take a patrol behind enemy lines and knock out the German machine gun nests that were holding up the regiment's advance. Early selected 16 men for the mission, 4 non-commissioned officers including Corporal York, and 13 privates. The patrol moved out before full daylight, working their way through the forest parallel to the German lines. Their orders were to infiltrate behind the enemy positions, locate the machine gun nests, and eliminate them. It was a dangerous mission that relied on stealth, speed, and luck. The patrol moved quietly through the misty forest, following a small valley that seemed to lead behind the German lines. After about a mile, they surprised a group of German soldiers, medics and headquarters personnel who had no idea American soldiers were so deep behind their lines. The Germans surrendered immediately, and Early's men began rounding them up. They had captured about 20 Germans and were organizing their prisoners when everything went catastrophically wrong. German soldiers on the hill above them suddenly opened fire with multiple machine guns. The Americans had stumbled into a major German position, the headquarters of a battalion that was preparing to counterattack American forces. Machine gun fire raked the Americans at close range. 6 men fell dead instantly, including Sergeant Early. 3 more were wounded, including the other corporals. In seconds, the patrol had lost more than half its men. The survivors dove for cover, trying to shield themselves and guard their prisoners simultaneously. Corporal Alvin York suddenly found himself in command of the 7 remaining able-bodied Americans. They were trapped in a small depression, pinned down by multiple machine guns on the hill above them, deep behind enemy lines with no support, and no way to call for help. By any reasonable assessment, they were all dead men. York made his decision instantly. While the other survivors stayed in the depression guarding the prisoners and returning fire, York worked his way to a position where he had a clear field of fire at the German machine gun nests about 25 yards away. Chapter 7: The Turkeys Shoot. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, though the exact details remain debated by historians. What is certain is that Corporal York, lying in a prone position with clear sight lines to the German positions, began to methodically kill German machine gunners. Years later, York described his thinking. "I was shooting from a prone position, just like we often shoot at targets in the shooting matches in the mountains of Tennessee, and it was just about the same distance. But the targets here were bigger. I just couldn't miss a German's head or body at that distance. And I didn't. Besides, it weren't no time to miss nohow." York used the skills learned hunting wild turkeys in Tennessee. "I touched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, and so on," he later reported. "That's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home. You see, we don't want the front ones to know that we're getting the back ones, and then they keep on coming until we get them all." The psychology was brilliant. By shooting the rear men first, York prevented the Germans in front from realizing their comrades were being killed. They kept manning their positions, and York kept shooting. His marksmanship was extraordinary, headshot after headshot, never wasting a bullet, never missing. As German machine gunners raised their heads to fire, York shot them. When they tried to relocate their guns, he shot them. When they attempted to spot his position, he shot them. He was a ghost in the forest, dealing death with cold precision. After York had killed about a dozen Germans this way, 6 German soldiers fixed bayonets and charged directly at him. They came fast, running down the hill in a desperate bayonet charge designed to overwhelm him before he could reload. York calmly drew his M19 11.45 caliber pistol. Drawing on his hunting instincts again, he shot the last man in the line first, then worked forward. "This was the only way to get them," he explained later. "If I'd shot the front one first, the others would have dropped down and taken cover, and I'd never have gotten them." 5 men fell before they got within 10 yards of York. The 6th German lunged at him with his bayonet. York shot him point-blank. All 6 attackers were dead in less than 10 seconds. Chapter 8: The Surrender. First Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, commanding the German 1st Battalion, 120th Reserve Infantry Regiment, watched from his position as his men were systematically killed by an enemy he couldn't see. He fired his entire pistol trying to kill York, but every shot missed. The invisible American sharpshooter just kept killing his soldiers with mechanical efficiency. Vollmer realized he was facing a disaster. He didn't know how many Americans were down in that depression. It could have been a platoon or a company for all he knew. What he did know was that his men were dying fast, and the situation was hopeless. The German lieutenant made a decision. He stood up, waving a white handkerchief, and shouted in English, "English! English! Stop! I surrender!" York, still behind his rifle, yelled back, "Well, come on then! And make it quick!" Vollmer responded, "If you don't shoot any more, I will make them give up." According to York's account, he accepted this offer, but told Vollmer, "All right, but drop your guns and equipment and come on up here." Vollmer shouted commands in German, and the remaining German soldiers in the machine gun positions threw down their weapons and stood up with their hands raised. York had killed or wounded enough of them that the survivors had lost all will to fight. York and his 7 men now had about 90 prisoners. But their situation was still precarious. They were deep behind enemy lines and had to get back to American positions. York ordered Vollmer to march at the front of the prisoner column as insurance against being shot by German rear guards. Chapter 9: The March Back. The strange procession began moving toward American lines, 132 German prisoners being marched by 8 American soldiers. It should have been impossible, but York's cold determination and Vollmer's cooperation made it work. As they approached the German front lines, York forced Vollmer to order any German units they encountered to surrender. When one group of Germans in a trench opened fire, York put his pistol to Vollmer's head and told him to make them stop. The German lieutenant complied, shouting orders that resulted in more German soldiers throwing down their weapons and joining the column of prisoners. The prisoner count kept growing. 40 became 60, then 80, then over 100. York kept his rifle ready and his men alert, but the march continued. The German soldiers, demoralized and exhausted, were apparently glad to be out of the fighting. When York and his tiny command finally reached American lines, they were an unbelievable sight: 8 muddy, exhausted American soldiers marching in 132 German prisoners. Officers came running to see this impossible spectacle. York reported to Brigadier General Julian Robert Lindsay, his brigade commander. The general looked at the massive column of prisoners and said, "Well, York, I hear you have captured the whole damn German army." York, always laconic, replied, "No, sir. I got only 132. Chapter 10: The Investigation. The story of York's feats spread through the American expeditionary forces like wildfire. It seemed too incredible to be true, one man killing over 20 Germans and capturing 132 prisoners. The army had to verify these claims before awarding any decorations. An investigation was launched. Officers interviewed York repeatedly, questioning him closely about every detail. They interviewed the 7 surviving soldiers from his patrol, all of whom confirmed York's account. They counted the German dead. 25 bodies were found in the area where York had fought, all killed by rifle fire. They interviewed German prisoners, including Lieutenant Vollmer, who confirmed that an American soldier had systematically killed the machine gunners before forcing their surrender. The investigators examined the site of the action and found 35 disabled German machine guns in the area York had attacked. They calculated distances, sight lines, and fields of fire. Everything checked out. York's account, though it seemed almost superhuman, was accurate. On November 1, 1918, Corporal York was promoted in the field to sergeant. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which was later upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. France awarded him the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. Italy and Montenegro also decorated him. But York had little time to think about medals. The war was still raging, and his regiment continued fighting until November 1st, when they were finally pulled back to a rest area. 10 days later, on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed and the guns fell silent. Chapter 11: The Hero Comes Home. When York returned to the United States in May 1919, he was stunned by the reception awaiting him. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, called him the greatest soldier of the war. The media had seized on his story as the perfect combination of American themes: the simple backwoodsman who embodied frontier virtues, the religious man who overcame his pacifism to fight for justice, the marksman whose skills learned hunting transformed into military heroism. New York gave him a massive parade. Dignitaries lined up to shake his hand. Businessmen offered him huge sums of money for endorsements, speaking tours, and his life story. York was offered $75,000 for a movie deal, an astronomical sum in 1919, equivalent to millions today. To everyone's surprise, York turned it all down. He told reporters, "Uncle Sam's uniform ain't for sale, and neither am I." He wanted no part of commercializing his military service. He accepted only one gift: a farm from the Tennessee state government, and various charitable groups, though even this came with complications that would plague him for years. On June 7, 1919, Sergeant York married Gracie Williams in a simple ceremony in Pall Mall. He returned to his beloved mountains, to the simple life of farming, hunting, and raising a family. He and Gracie would eventually have 10 children together. But York couldn't completely escape his fame, nor did he entirely want to. He had seen a larger world beyond the Cumberland Mountains, had experienced the industrial might of modern civilization, and he wanted to bring some of that progress back to his isolated community. Chapter 12: The School Builder. York's consuming passion in the years after the war became education. He had attended school for only 9 months. He knew that without education, the children of Fentress County would remain trapped in poverty, cut off from opportunities in the modern world. In 1926, York founded the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, now the Alvin C. York Institute, in Jamestown, Tennessee. The school focused on vocational training, teaching practical skills like agriculture, mechanics, and trades alongside traditional academics. York believed in education that prepared young people for real work, not just book learning. To fund the school, York reluctantly began giving paid lectures and speeches. He traveled around Tennessee and neighboring states, speaking about his experiences and about the importance of education. He was never comfortable with public speaking. He remained a shy, modest man who preferred action to words, but he forced himself to do it for the sake of the children. York used his fame to lobby for better roads in Fentress County. The region was so isolated that getting goods to market or accessing medical care was nearly impossible. Through his efforts, the Tennessee government built a highway through the mountains, the Alvin C. York Highway, that opened up the region to development. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, York lived simply on his farm, worked the land, raised his children, and devoted himself to improving his community. He refused repeated offers to cash in on his fame. He lived modestly and struggled financially, often in debt despite his national celebrity. Chapter 13: The Reluctant Movie Star. By 1940, with war again engulfing Europe and America moving toward involvement, Hollywood producers saw renewed potential in York's story. Warner Brothers offered York a deal to make a movie about his life, but with a critical difference from earlier offers, the studio agreed that all proceeds beyond a modest amount for York would go to his school. York agreed, but on strict conditions. He insisted that the movie portray him accurately, including his religious beliefs and his initial opposition to war. He wanted Gary Cooper, a respected actor known for playing understated, decent men, to play him. He served as technical advisor on the film. Sergeant York, released in July 1941, was a massive success. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film became one of the highest-grossing movies of 1941 and remains a classic of American cinema. It arrived at a critical moment in American history, just months before Pearl Harbor, and its message about a reluctant warrior who overcomes his pacifism to fight for his country resonated powerfully with audiences. York attended the premiere in New York but felt uncomfortable with the glamorization of his story. He donated his portion of the proceeds to his school and to various charitable causes. He never saw himself as a hero, just as a soldier who did his duty. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the 54-year-old York tried to re-enlist. The Army rejected him. He was too old, overweight, and suffering from various health problems including arthritis. Instead, York served on the home front, touring the country to sell war bonds and boost morale. He visited military bases, spoke to troops, and supported the war effort in any way he could. Chapter 14: The Cost of Heroism. The years after World War II were difficult for York. He suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1948 that left him increasingly disabled. He developed financial problems. The farm was never profitable, and his school required constant fundraising. The IRS claimed he owed back taxes on income from the movie, though York had donated most of it to charity. The dispute dragged on for years, causing him significant stress. By 1954, York was largely confined to a wheelchair. His health continued to decline, though his mind remained sharp. He watched as the world changed around him: the Cold War, the Korean War, the early years of Vietnam. He saw his children grow up and his community gradually modernize with better roads, electricity, and schools. York never lost his deep religious faith or his commitment to his community. Even from his wheelchair, he continued to advocate for education and to support his school. He corresponded with veterans, granted occasional interviews to historians, and remained a modest, thoughtful man despite his legendary status. Friends and visitors noted that York never glorified war or violence. When asked about his combat experiences, he spoke matter-of-factly about doing what had to be done, but he never celebrated the killing. He maintained that war was sometimes necessary but always tragic. Chapter 15: The Last Battle. On September 2, 1964, Sergeant Alvin C. York died at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 76 years old. The cause was complications from his series of strokes. His funeral in Pall Mall was attended by hundreds of people, including military dignitaries, government officials, and plain folks from the mountains who had known Alvin all his life. He was buried in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, not far from the cabin where he had been born 76 years earlier. Tennessee Governor Frank Clement ordered flags lowered to half-staff. President Lyndon Johnson sent condolences. Newspapers across America ran obituaries celebrating his life and heroism. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the simple country people of Fentress County, who mourned the loss of a neighbor who had never forgotten where he came from. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe and like it, and join our community of history lovers. We want to hear your voice. Leave a comment on the video, tell us where you come from, or share any family history related to the war. You are not just a spectator, you are helping us spread the truth about the heroism of the war years. We read every comment, and they really inspire us to work. See you next time.